Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. My name is Alex McCutcheon from UNICOM. We're hosting the webinar today, which I'm delighted to say is on models, frameworks, and messy coherence. Our presenter is Dave Snowden. Dave's the founder and Chief Scientific Officer of Cognitive Edge. His works internationally and covers government and commercial organisations looking and specialising in complex issues relating to strategy, organisational decision-making, and general decision-making. Today, Dave's going to bring to the forefront the need for building on history, our perception of the past and present, and really knowing that we'll never get a greenfield. This is something really very interesting because we discussed this when Dave gave a keynote at our Enterprise Architecture Forum back in March, and it was certainly made a lot of people think and generated a lot of interest and discussion. So what I'm going to do is, without further ado, hand over to Dave.
Okay, just 2 seconds. Right, and I don't plan to use many slides on this. Yeah, I'm shortly going to put 1 or 2 ideas up. But the idea is I speak for about 30-40 minutes and then we open up for questions. And my goal really here is to raise some issues so we can think about things in a fairly different way. I should just say that the internet connection here at the Grand Hyatt in Washington, which you would expect would be perfect, has been a little bit iffy. So I hope everything works fine. Right? So I want to start off by introducing a key sort of metaphor or concept. Yeah? And at this point I'm going to share the screen, so hopefully that will work. This comes from a book by Alicia Giraro, and Kurtz and I quote this in an article we wrote called Like Brambles in a Thicket After It. And it basically says that if you're dealing with any type of system which involves human beings or uncertainty, and I'll come back to those later, the best metaphor to understand it is not some neat, tidy, ordered structure, the sort of thing you see in the diagrams of systems architects who seem to have an obsession with boxes and arrows and decision trees. Nor is it in the process maps that you typically see coming out of consultancy exercise that then move into a SAP implementation or whatever, or the neat and tidy organizational flowcharts. Now, all of those are important, and I'm going to come back to their importance later. But the reality is most of what we deal with when we're dealing with human systems is much more like a bramble bush. It's difficult to say, well, one thing starts and where other thing ends. To actually really understand it, I have to take it apart, and I can't put it back together again. It's never the same thing. It's what I call messily coherent. You can see patterns in it. You can see form. It produces fruit. It produces value. It produces barriers. It does all sorts of good things. But it's not neat and tidy and ordered. It's messy, but that mess actually has high utility. And the basic argument I'm going to be making today is fundamentally a switch from the sort of mechanical or engineering metaphor which has dominated the last 20 or 30 years of management science, originally associated with systems dynamics, but now moved well away from that, and effectively argue instead for a switch to a organic or an ecological metaphor in which what's important is not to define an idealized future state, but rather to understand the present and make changes in the present. Now, in doing that, I'm not coming from an empirical background. This is not going to be a case-based approach. I'm not going to argue here are 55 cases, and from that I've developed a general recipe. What I'm going to be arguing instead for is a theory-based approach. Now, to introduce this, again, I'm going to take an ecological metaphor and a key concept, something called dominant predator theory. Now, the way this works in ecology is if an ecology is disrupted, then a new dominant predator emerges, and thereafter the rest of the ecology organizes around that predator, and the two are interdependent, like hyenas with a lion or whatever. And then effectively the predator, the dominant predator, survives no matter how incompetent they are until the ecology itself is disrupted, at which point space emerges for a new predator. Now, a good example of this is a book by Jim Collins called Good to Great, where he selects a series of companies who he holds to have been successful for a long period of time. It's becoming a bit embarrassing with recent financial results, but let's leave that aside for the moment. And he then identifies things they do in common. This is the basic empirical approach. He's looking for common patterns in examples of success, and then those common patterns can be codified and generalized as recipes, and then if you follow that recipe, the idea is you too will get the same success. Now, in science, this is called the confusion of correlation with causation. The fact that 20 successful companies have managers and directors with regular bowel movements doesn't follow that if you recruit your future managers on the basis of observation of the toilet habits of recruits, that you're going to be successful. Regular bowel movements are associated with lack of stress, so there may be some linkage, but it's not a causal linkage. And with the same issue in good to great, there are all sorts of good things which are extracted, there are all sorts of valuable lessons from which we can learn, and don't misunderstand me, I'm not arguing against our ability to learn from examples, I'm arguing against causal recipes. But we haven't got a prescriptive recipe, because if you look at the companies he chooses, and IBM is one of them, and I worked there for 7 years, he's chosen a dominant predator, effectively somebody who created a new market, who instantiated a period of uncertainty to create something radically new. Now, dominant predator theory gives us a much easier explanation of success and also an easier prescription for how we to take action. So during conditions of high stability, the only successful strategy is to work with the dominant predator, maybe to take second mover advantage, to use another buzz phrase. On the other hand, during periods of uncertainty, you have to work out a way in which you become the dominant predator, because then the ecology will stabilize around you. So when a meteor hit the Earth and the dinosaurs more or less got wiped out, if you'd had to predict the future dominant predator based on who survived, you'd have gone for the crocodile or the shark. You wouldn't have gone for a small fluffy thing called the first mammal hiding away somewhere in the debris. The reality is mammals then went on to dominate the next period. And you see this in industry. IBM creates the computer industry, it misses the switch to microcomputers, the ecology shifts, and then software companies dominate the next period, Microsoft and everybody else. And we're going through the same shift at the moment, and that's the essence of my argument, is we're going through a period of dynamic, sudden, rapid change, and really instantiated around three things. One is a depression. Economic depressions always create the space for something new. A radical new technology, and I'd argue at the moment the development of pervasive technology, the Internet of Things, all of these sort of things are a much more dramatic change than everything we've seen before. And the third is a new way of understanding theory, a new way of getting insight, because during positions of uncertainty you can't repeat the past because the past is changing too quickly. Therefore what you have to do is what is called theory-informed practice. You have to apply theory, not repetition of past practice. So what I want to do is to go through a couple of aspects of theory, talk through the implications, and then give some idea of where this is going. So the first is to understand more about the nature of humans and human decision-making. Now, there's been an assumption for the past 20 or 30 years that human beings make decisions on a rational basis. So the idea is if you have the right people and they have the right training, the right competences, and the right tools and the right support, they will make the right decisions. There's also an assumption behind pseudosciences like Myers-Briggs and a lot of the psychometric tests, and they are pseudosciences, so they have no real basis in science, that you can actually categorize people in the same way that you categorize units within a manufacturing process. And all of this is based on the assumption, effectively an assumption that you can plan a rational state and that you're building on a greenfield site. You can decide what system you want, you can decide the goals you want to achieve, you can set key performance indicators, you can determine process, and then any failure to achieve the defined future state is a failure of process, a failure of management, failure of data capture, or whatever. Now, that description is true, of a certain type of highly constrained human decision-making. And the idea of defining a future state and closing the gap is true of a highly constrained system, something we'll come on to in a minute. But the reality of human decision-making is different. Let's take a couple of examples. If you show a bunch of radiologists a picture of an X-ray, and in that X-ray you hide a picture of a gorilla, well actually you don't hide it, you make it several times larger than the cancer nodules they're looking for, and ask the radiologist, the deep expert, to scan the X-ray for anomalies. Although 83% of them will physically scan the picture of a gorilla, only a very small percentage will actually notice it. We don't notice things we don't expect to see. And the reason for that is we evolved as pattern-based intelligences, not rational processes. We scan about 3 to 4% of what's available to us on a good day, unless we're autistic, in which case we'll scan everything, but then we won't do anything. So most of us scan 2 to 3%. We then match it against patterns stored in our memory, and the most frequently used patterns, and for a radiologist it's 30 or 40,000, the most frequently used patterns are nearer the surface of the brain, they get activated first. So what we do is a first fit pattern match, not a best fit pattern match. We evolve to satisfy, not to optimize. And you can think about it in evolutionary terms, it makes an awful lot of sense. Yeah, the early hominoids on the savannas of Africa, something large and yellow with very sharp teeth runs towards you at high speed. Do you want to autistically scan all available data, look up a catalogue of the flora and fauna of the African veldt, and having identified the lion, look up best practice case studies on how to deal with lions. By that time, the only document of any use to you will be how to escape from the digestive tract of a large carnivore, and the only case I know of that is the Book of Jonah, and I don't recommend actually planning your business on that basis. So we evolved to make decisions very, very quickly based on partial data recognition. And that has major importance if you launch a new initiative. You're implementing a new SAP system. You're going through process re-engineering. You're going through a process of making the company more efficient. You're designing a new systems architecture. All of these sort of things. The minute you actually announce those things, they don't fall into a greenfield. They fall into a pattern of past narrative. So if you've had a pattern of past failure, which is normal, and people pay more attention to failure, so that will trigger faster, then people aren't viewing your proposal rationally. They're viewing it through the patterns of past failure and occasionally through the patterns of past success. It's actually much more effective to change things in the present. Because if I do multiple small changes in the present and see what works, then I can stabilize the things which work, and that stabilization then actually builds into a future state that I couldn't have imagined but is more sustainable. And technology now supports this. My own view is the day of massive enterprise-wide resource planning software, things like SAP, the days of things like SharePoint in knowledge management, the days of highly complex systems architectures where everything is defined and the flows are defined, is kind of like no longer necessary. We've now got both the conceptual architecture and the technological architecture to do things different. So, for example, a robust technological architecture allows software objects and people to interact over time so that applications are emergent properties of that interaction between finely grained software components and people's emerging and changing needs and desires. And we've already got a golden example of how that works in the internet and in the app market. That isn't designed, the architecture is designed in the sense of understanding constraints and limitations, but within those constraints you have the ability for mass emergence and constant radical resilience adaptiveness. So it's not like we haven't got the theoretical frameworks and the technology to manage this. We're just locked into an engineering pattern which is based on bridges rather than software objects. And I mean bridges in the sense of big things that span rivers. And we're still kind of like using those sort of metaphors. So I say human beings are pattern-based intelligences, not machine processing intelligences. And that's of critical importance. Secondly, there's a whole body of human knowledge which takes time to develop. So the Australians very sensibly don't allow children after they pass the driving test to drive with passengers other than close family for 2 years. And one of the cognitive science reasons for that is it takes 2 years for the brain and the body to co-evolve to the point where you've actually got a capacity to drive at a subconscious level so you can pay attention to conversation. If you don't know the figures, accidents amongst young people go up exponentially with the number of passengers where the passengers aren't close family. Now, the reason for that is that actually consciousness is a distributed function of the brain and the body. And there's a whole body of skills and capabilities, which include things like software testing, programming capability, design capability, understanding people, which require time and experience and a degree of stress and threat for them to actually develop in humans, both individual and consciously. You can't just run on a training course or build a knowledge management system, because human knowledge is, the cliche is wetware, which I hate, but actually human knowledge is organic. It's not just binary processes. It's organic, it's experiential, it requires change. And that means in architecting systems, we've got to recognize that. We've got to recognize the need for modern forms of apprenticeship, something I'm working on with the Agile community at the moment, but also the need to recognize the pattern of time and expectation for systemic change. So that leads me naturally onto systems and the nature of systems. Now, there are actually three types of system which exist in nature: ordered systems, chaotic systems, and complex systems. And all of them have different utility and different application. And part of our problem at the moment is all organizations and all management theory, with a few exceptions, works on the assumption of order, i.e. of constrainable systems, where you've got repeatable linear relationships between cause and effect. So I can actually mandate the results of something if I do it within some degree of constraint. Now, an ordered system is a highly constrained system. The level of constraint is such that all behavior can be controlled, deviance is easily identified, and can be easily eliminated. This is something unique to humans in the animal kingdom. You might in the minerals, count granite rocks as having similar stability, but fundamentally human beings are pretty good at this. It's part of our social evolution. It's something we've learned how to do, and we particularly learned how to do it with tools, both physical tools and software tools. So, for example, these days in hospitals, people count the number of surgical instruments left at the end of an operation and check they're the same as were there at the start. As I get older, I think this is of increasing importance. You do not want to know the figures for the number of surgical instruments which were accidentally left in people's bodies until this simple procedure was instituted. So there's a whole body of areas where rigid order, rigid constraints have huge value. The trouble is we get seduced by it and we carry it to excess. So one of the things we see in heavily rule-based environments is that people are habituated to rule breaking to get the job done. I'm doing a lot of work in health and safety at the moment, and one of the characteristics we're seeing there is that in most large companies, health and safety have created so many rules and processes, largely, if I'm brutally honest about it, to actually avoid legal liability rather than to make people healthier and safer, in which the only way the job can get done on a regular basis is to break the rules. So instead of rule breaking being exceptional, which means that human beings pay attention to things, rule breaking has actually become habitual, which means people become casual. So we're actually seeing a rapid increase in serious accidents, including fatal deaths, either sort of accidents that people can't choose not to report because they're pretty evident. Now, that excessive use of order is actually bad because of the nature of human attentions. We pay attention, but we don't pay attention to routine things. We pay attention to exceptions. If human beings know they cross a boundary, they will behave in a different way. So to give a personal example of health and safety, something like 20 years ago, I took my then young and charming daughter. She's now older and charming. There was a period between I'm trying to forget, but I love her still. At that time, she was about 4 or 5 years old. I carried her up to the top of a Welsh castle, Conwy Castle, and she accidentally, on purpose, I think, well, she says it was accidental, I think it was on purpose, dropped her toy rabbit, one of these fluffy toys, over the side of the castle. It dropped down 30 meters, and kind of like, this is a problem. It's the rabbit without which we cannot go to sleep at night. And that justifies any amount of rule breaking by fathers who are now in a state of potential trauma, because they will be held responsible for this, and they will be the one who has to get up during the night and deal with the problem. Actually, come to think of it, I think she was 3, not 5. It was even younger, so you can imagine the problem. Either way, then and now again, now I've lost weight, I can go back to this. I was a climber as a hobby. From a climber's point of view, a castle wall is nothing. It's vertical, it's got handholds. So I went over the side of the castle wall, climbed down 30 meters, collected said rabbit, climbed back up and restored it to tearful daughter. And that was worth the hour and a half I spent in the police station explaining my behavior because actually this was breaking the rules. The interesting thing is I was never safer than when I went over that wall, because I knew I didn't have the right shoes on, I didn't have sticky boots, I didn't have rope, I didn't have chalk, I didn't have anything to secure myself. So I knew I was taking a risk, but I was therefore in a heightened state of alert, and time slows down when that happens. You've got more time to make decisions. And for the first time since I learned to climb on the Idwal slabs, 20 years before that as it happens, I was repeating to myself the fundamental heuristic of climbing: 3 points of contact, 3 points of contact. I didn't move one limb until the other 3 were secure. And heuristics are one of the most effective ways of providing control in conditions of extreme uncertainty. Now, we're now taking that basic concept of fewer, more rigid rules, but rules about when rules can be broken, with heuristics to govern behavior after that, as a whole new approach in software testing, system design, health and safety in manufacturing processes, because it recognizes the reality of the human condition, that we need fewer, memorable, enforceable rules, but we need boundary conditions where we now have to behave differently. So I say there's nothing wrong with order, provided we realize its limits and provided we allow for order systems to be broken under conditions of uncertainty. We don't create a rigid model. The other problem with this, and you see this with process re-engineering and things like SAP implementations, is people go for the average. They start to manage to the center of a normal distribution, when actually the real value of an organization, particularly in terms of innovation and threat, comes in the clusters of the tails of fat tails, not thin tails. And that's where large companies effectively engineer themselves to the point where they lose adaptive capacity, because their ability to change is a proverbial oil tanker. It just takes too long. And again, in systems design terms, objects within more loose, lightly constrained architectures give far more dynamic capability than ERP and classic operations procedures. So ordered systems have huge value, they create predictability, but taken to excess, they force people into disruptive behavior, they force people to work beneath the radar, they effectively institute a culture of habitual rule breaking, which is actually dangerous in both ethical and operational terms. We then get chaotic systems, and chaotic systems are one where there are no constraints whatsoever. I should make it clear at this point that there's no consensus on what the language means yet, so we all kind of like use it a bit differently. So some people would talk, when I talk about chaos, they would actually say at random. When I use complex, they would use chaos. It doesn't matter too much, provided the definitions are done. So in a chaotic system, there are no connections between anything, which means you get complete randomness. Now, if that happens accidentally, it's called a crisis, and it won't survive for long. It's actually very difficult for a system to survive without constraints. So what will happen very quickly is constraints will be imposed, and the secret is to be the person who imposes them. And there's a whole body of work. I spend an hour or so teaching this on the courses we run, about actually different types of crises, how you manage them, the nature of constraints. It's not just a simple take control in a conventional sense. It's much more nuanced than that once you understand it. But crisis management aside, there are 2 other uses of chaos which have high value. One is if you can remove all constraints for a limited period of time, you get radical disruptive innovation. But it's difficult to remove constraints, but if done, it can be very valuable. The second is effectively for what we call human sensor networks. So we're building systems at the moment where the entire workforce can be consulted on a strategic or operational matter over the same 3-minute period in real time to create a new approach to evidence-based policy. And what we're doing there is to draw on statistical and cognitive science theory, which says if a huge amount, particularly a wide, diverse range of agents, make a mathematical decision in real time in parallel without knowledge of each other or without knowledge of intent, you've got a whole new way of creating evidence-based policy under conditions of uncertainty. And again, that approach justifies a lecture in its own right. But we're now starting controlled experiments in Wales, for example, to create citizen sensor networks which potentially actually destroy the whole market research industry. In fact, if you want an example of an industry which is about to go through a Kodak moment, it's market research, and you can see that coming. So chaotic systems, like ordered systems, have high value. but they require high energy to maintain. And the common characteristic of both order and chaos is a huge amount of management control, which is a bit ironic given chaos is randomness, but randomness takes time and effort. It's rather like nuclear fusion. You have to put at the moment you have to put more energy in to maintain the magnetic field, to contain the plasma, than you get energy out. So you get value out of it, but you need to be careful, high energy content. On the other hand, the natural state of affairs is a complex adaptive system. And this is one where constraints modify themselves in the light of behavior, sometimes informally, sometimes formally. Some constraints are completely informal, like taboo. Some are rules or guidance procedures, principles, heuristics. But then they in turn modify behavior, but behavior modifies constraint. And the biological phrase for this is constraint and behavior co-evolves. And one of the key aspects of coevolution is wherever you are is where you have to start from, because you're dealing with people's memories of the past and perception of the present. And that's the concept of brownfield in architecture. You can never go backwards and start again. You always have to start from where the coevolutionary process has taken you. And that's a complex adaptive system. It requires very low energy, but it's inherently unpredictable. Again, a chaotic system I can predict by modeling. I can do that by agent-based modeling, by all sorts of processes. Ordered systems I can predict by traditional stochastic and other processes. There's lots of things I can do. I can create a degree of certainty and control in order and chaos. But in complexity, I'm dealing with a system which has no linear material cause. There is no repetition of cause and effect. The same thing will only happen again the same way twice by accident, not by design. So take a metaphor for this. If I have a large coarse surface with a high coefficient of resistance, around that surface I have electromagnets which can change in polarity and strength, and on the surface I have a whole lot of small cast iron hockey pucks. Sorry, I've been challenged on this metaphor by physicists, so I'm making sure my physics is right. If all of the magnets keep the same polarity and the same strength, the cast iron hockey pucks will maintain a stable pattern. If I change one of the magnets, then the hockey pucks will change in a predictable and repeatable way. I either say if I change the same magnet with the same starting conditions, the same thing will happen. Now that in traditional approaches to systems, which have dominated the last 20 or 30 years, is basically called a driver. And everybody is seeking what are the drivers of consumer behavior, what are the drivers of employee behavior, because they're seeking a causal relationship which allows them to pull the lever and produce a predictable effect. The trouble is, if the system is a complex adaptive system, then the next time I change one magnet, 3 others change polarity, 5 others change strength, and the iron ball bearings, the iron hockey pucks, never ever form the same pattern twice. They're constantly fluidly flexing or changing. Now, like the bramble bushes, there's a pattern to it. I can sense or see the pattern in real time. I can modify magnets to actually change the direction if I can control them, but some I can't. So effectively, I'm managing a dynamic flux in which I'm enabling the evolution of a potential which I can't define in advance, but I will recognize when I get there. And that's the huge hope and promise of complexity, because it allows us to do more with significantly less. So basically, I ask myself 3 very simple questions. What can I change? And out of the class of things that I can change, where could I monitor the impact of that change? Because changing things where you can't monitor the impact is just foolishness, dealing with uncertainty. And out of the things where I can monitor the change, where could I amplify success or reverse failure? And that's the basic rule of managing a complex adaptive system. In order to do that, I need to work with more finely grained objects, smaller organizational units, not large matrix-based structures, smaller information units, object-oriented software development. I need small things which can combine and recombine in different ways. Again, that gives us a whole new approach to DevOps and everything else. I also need to distribute the cognitive process, because if people are only scanning 2 or 3% of what's in front of them, I need multiple scanners with diverse perspectives who can't collude to actually see what's going on, so I spot things early enough to take action. And finally, a key concept called disintermediation, which means I need to remove the mediating levels between the decision maker and the raw data. Now that concept comes from what we originally did in counterterrorism before and after 9/11 for DARPA, in which the goal is that an NSA in the States can actually go directly from an abstract representation of the space to the raw intelligence data without multiple agencies interpreting it en route. So that's kind of like a grand scheme of things. And we're doing that stuff at the moment in counter-narco work, entrepreneurial startup in Colombia, a whole body of work. But then at a very prosaic level, we now move to a whole new approach to user requirements capture. Instead of sending systems analysts out who have preconception and will pay attention to things that match that preconception, and they can't avoid that, that's part of being human. There's nothing wrong about them or they're trained, that's just what being human is. We actually get a representative sample of users to keep continuous diaries with human metadata. This is an approach we developed and patented, which I haven't got time to go into. But fundamentally, people self-interpret into a quantitative, not a qualitative framework. And that gives us a huge amount of what are called micro-narratives, in which I can sense or see clustered patterns. So if I get a cluster of patterns of day-to-day frustrations, desires, hopes, or whatever, then I put a bunch of small programming team, this could be pair programming if I go back to XP, to actually develop a fast prototype to build an object to move into my architecture and see if it works, if it takes up. If it does, I standardize it or operationalize it. So as things gradually become more stable, gradually get more used, I put more design effort, more stabilization, more structure, because I'm moving from exploration to exploitation. So disintermediation is a key concept because it means I understand a complex adaptive system by interacting with it, by testing through multiple parallel safe-to-fail experiments to see what are the evolutionary possibilities of the system. As things work, I increase the constraint levels so they become increasingly ordered. If the constraints don't bite, I go back and experiment again. And we have a whole body of methods and rules around this. So, for example, anybody involved in Scrum, Scrum is an example of iterative attempts to actually get something right, and has huge value. This is a pre-Scrum process because you're doing parallel safe-to-fail experiments in which you make sure the experiments contradict so that some are bound to fail, but you don't know which. You introduce naivety, you introduce obliqueness. There's a whole set of rules and processes around this that allow you to manage more effectively. So all of this kind of comes together in the thing called the Cynefin framework. Cynefin is a Welsh word. It means the place of your multiple belongings or origins. It's crudely translated into English as place or habitat, but it means far more than that. It carries this concept of belonging and uncertainty. So it's a good name for a complexity model. Now, Cynefin divides order into two, obvious and complicated. In obvious order, we have rigid constraints. There is a relationship between cause and effect which is self-evident to any reasonable person. Therefore, I can enforce best practice because I can sense incoming data, categorize it based on known processes, and respond in accordance with predefined approaches. So, for example, in civilized countries, we drive on the left-hand side of the road. So if you drive on the right-hand side of the road in a civilized country, sorry about this, I'm just in a belligerent mood, then you can expect the consequences. In southern Italy, it doesn't matter what side of the road you drive on, provided you drive with confidence, but that's a different matter. So there are all sorts of things where we agree to do things because we could have done them another way, but we just decided to do it this way because it makes sense. So in Sweden in the 1960s, they switched from driving on the left to driving on the right, and they did that for logical, rational reasons to make border crossings to Norway, Denmark, etc. far easier. So there's a whole body of things. We decide to do things one way, and critically, everybody buys into it because the relationship between cause and effect is obvious. It's self-evident. In complicated order, on the other hand, we don't have rigid constraints, we have governing constraints. There's a degree of freedom, a degree of latitude available. And our decision process is we have to analyze what's going on because it's not self-evident to everybody engaged. So we need some sort of evidence, some sort of proof, either achieved through trusted experts or some sort of analytical process. And within that structure, we can then respond, but we apply good practice, not best practice, which means, as I say, it's governing, not rigid. There are variations which are permitted to people with the right training. And a big mistake in consultancy-led process re-engineering is to try and focus on obvious when a lot of things are complicated. An even bigger mistake is to forget that a lot of things are also complex. So remember the magnets? In a complex adaptive system, I have what are called enabling constraints. So for example, allowing people to self-organize without any constraints at all just produces anarchy. Introducing constraints about team membership but still allowing self-selection, that's the complex adaptive system. So enabling constraints are things I test, I put in place, I'm prepared to modify them, and I understand the system by multiple parallel safe-to-fail experiments. Effectively, I do parallel probes, I sense the results, I respond accordingly, and any practice will be an emergent practice. And then in a chaotic space, I have an absence of constraints, so I'm going to act, sense, respond, and any practice is going to be novel, it's going to be unusual, it's going to be different, it's why it's an innovation space. But I have to act decisively either to maintain the state or to move out of it in a controlled way. Now, Cynefin has other aspects to it. It has a central domain called disorder, which divides into a legitimate transitionary state and an illegitimate space, that's the dark bit in the middle, which means a state of not knowing whether you're ordered, complex, or chaotic, so you do whatever's most comfortable. A lot of people forget the fifth domain, but it's critical. And finally, obvious is shown next to chaotic, because actually if we assume that things are obvious, we apply rigid constraints where it's inappropriate. The informal activity in the organization builds until when the break comes, it's catastrophic, and we fall into chaos. So the Cynefin framework is a sense-making framework. It's designed not to say that something is wrong and another thing is right, but to say some things are right in some contexts and wrong in another. So all of the traditional approaches of development ops, of process re-engineering, of enterprise architecture have generally developed on the assumption of complicated and to a lesser degree obvious. Techniques like Scrum are techniques to manage a transfer from complex to complicated, because they've got a roughly formed idea that they're then iterated to get it right. That means they're increasing the constraint to see if they get repeatability. So if you look at this blue dynamic, I'm moving from complex to complicated, and as it sustains itself, I can then exploit it, I can scale it, I can make it an operational process. And what's interesting, at this point, we start to move into a manufacturing metaphor, but in a complex space, we're in an ecological metaphor. And far too much of software development and operational control uses manufacturing metaphors. And of course, that's where process re-engineering and Six Sigma come from. Yeah, they actually come from manufacturing, which is a closed, ordered system. And they don't work when they apply to service or innovation, which is an open, ambiguous system. So the stable dynamic is a constant shift between complicated and between complex and complicated. Increasing the constraints. If the constraints bite, I put more in place. If that works, I exploit it. But then I destabilize the system from time to time to make sure I don't become ossified. If you want to think about it, if you ride a bicycle, there are two unpleasant states. One is trying to ride very, very slowly, and the other is riding far too quickly. Yeah, you need to keep a cadence appropriate for your industry, and that will be much faster in retail than it is in aircraft manufacturing. So the cadence changes within context. Occasionally, you may need to do what's called a shallow dive into chaos. Yeah, what that actually means is you've allowed the system to become ossified, you haven't moved it back into complex frequently enough, so you're going to have to remove all of the constraints for a period to actually create dynamic change. IBM famously did this when they sent a team away to Florida to produce the IBM PC and removed all constraints. I mean, they almost went bankrupt at that time because they didn't change fast enough, but they created a random environment. They removed constraints from a group of people for a short period of time, which allowed a new pattern to emerge. And finally, only a small amount of material actually drops then into the obvious space, and it may be 80% of your value. You know, don't take this as a pejorative statement. It just means it's now stable enough, we can exploit the hell out of it, and we can now standardize it, we can put it into rigid processes. So a modern approach to process management is to say that process re-engineering is appropriate to the complicated domain, but in the complex domain we need a different set of processes based on ambiguity, experimentation, discovery, emergence. Yeah? Serendipity, accidental discovery of connections between things, And critically, a complex system has to be inefficient in order to be effective. When it moves into the complicated space, we can focus on efficiency, but that's very dangerous in the complex space, which is why the excessive application of things like Six Sigma, for example in 3M, caused them ultimately to abandon it in all bar-core manufacturing because it was destroying their capacity to innovate. And just as a sideline, anybody who talks about Lean Six Sigma doesn't understand Lean, because Lean is about eliminating the waste that rigidly constrained techniques like Six Sigma create in the first place. So basically, what I'm trying to do is to understand what's called multi-ontology sense-making. Different types of system require different types of research, different types of method, different types of intervention, different types of measurement. And I want to kind of like leave you with a key concept on here. Some new scientists actually went through all the research available on human motivation. And the key thing they came up with is that without any exception, and there really was no exceptions to this, where people are working for explicit rewards, it destroys intrinsic motivation over time. To manage uncertainty, we need our employees to be intrinsically motivated, not working for overstructured or overdefined targets. Now again, there's a whole body of work we're doing in the development sector to measure success without having to define KPIs in advance. So we can understand and we can measure the health of a complex system, but we can't determine its outcome. But we can manage the emergence in a brownfield site of new stable structures which allow us to exploit a space that we discovered by experimentation. And that's the new metaphor for design, and it goes way beyond things like design thinking. It moves into a whole new science-based field of theory and of practice. Okay, I've used my time up and open to any questions. And I'm quite happy with the stunned silence, and I'm quite happy with arguments. So it's all over to you.
Thanks, Dave. I think there's one question just come in from Rob Peddle.
Hi, Rob. I'm trying to read it, but I haven't got much room on my screen, so hang on a minute. You manage obvious states is understanding behavior. I'd be careful on behavioral auditing. I mean, there have been two disasters in the history of psychology, right? One is behavioralism, and the other is the information processor model of the human mind. I'm not so sure that negative activity also isn't useful. We normally deliberately introduce worse practice systems because they have high learning capability. One of the things we're about to launch actually is a whole new approach to mapping culture by getting stories about decisions and then using cultural anthropology to identify underlying attitudes and beliefs to give indicators. And the interesting thing is this is also related to the work we're doing on health and safety. In that attitudinal measures are lead indicators, whereas compliance is a lag indicator. So, I mean, I know you well enough to Rob, you know, you don't mean it quite the way I interpreted it, but I wanted to make the point. Fundamentally, we can't produce predictive models, but we can produce maps of dispositions so we can see how things are likely to evolve. And we shouldn't worry too much about negative stories. We're finding, for example, in the work we're doing with one major manufacturing company, the stories that people learn from are not stories told by health and safety about how you can be safe if you follow the rules. They're stories about how I broke the rules and fucking nearly died, and now I've learned from it. And actually, it's those stories of near misses which actually have the most value in learning. Any more?
I don't think we have any more questions coming in at the moment.
That's okay.
Okay. Just to let everybody know also that we will be making a recording available afterwards, so we'll send a link to everybody a day or so after the webinar today. And also, if you'd like to come and see Dave in person, as it were, in London, he's going to be speaking at our 3 co-located conferences on the 20th of November in Kensington. We have 3 events: Enterprise Architecture Forum, DevOps Summit, and Process Improvement Conference. And Dave's giving the closing plenary keynote presentation there, so I hope you'll be able to meet him there. The website, by the way, for those is unicom.co.uk, and you'll see on there we've got tabs for our various conferences, also for the webinars, the webinar recordings from other recent presentations as well. So I think, Dave, thank you very much indeed. I think that seems to be it in terms of questions. I was just spoke too soon. We've got one question. In your opinion, what benefit could be gained by incorporating anthropologists in the scenario of complex systems? This is by Barney Henderson.
We use anthropologists a lot, but we tend to use anthropologists on the biological end of anthropology rather than the sociological end of anthropology. But the stuff we're doing on cultural mapping is entirely based on cultural anthropology, and my daughter has just got a master's in anthropology as well and won the prize for the best thesis, so I'm particularly into anthropologists at the moment. I think anthropologists know more about culture and human behavior than most HR professionals will learn in their lifespan. Yeah. But I would be very careful, because you've got a whole bunch of people who are claiming to be ethnographers who haven't been through ethnographic training, and you've got a whole bunch of anthropologists who are moving sideways without really thinking about it. But I think a lot of value in doing that. And certainly, by the way, I say this for anybody who's a father. If you've got children who are thinking about things like philosophy or sociology, get them to look at anthropology. It's actually much more what those disciplines were about when they started. And they've all become very structured, whereas anthropology is a bit more fluid. Okay.
Thank you, Dave. I think that wraps it up. We're pretty well spot on time. So again, thank you, and thanks to Dave for a great webinar. Goodbye.
Okay. Cheers, guys.